Great. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here and to see all of you. And thank you for setting the stage so amazingly well. We have been a great partner, and we've enjoyed that partnership so much with you, especially the work on the PopTech Innovation Lab. It's really been incredible. So why don't I start out with a PopTech pop quiz. How many of you know who this person is? There are people in the 60s here? Who is it? Janis Joplin. Well, she would feel very at home, I think, in this hall where I understand just last week Jethro Tull played. So a great place for rock and roll, among many other things. Can any of you then tell me where this is? This is Joplin, Missouri, in the Midwest, right on Route 66. Let me show you another site of Joplin. This was on May 22nd, 2011, when a multi-vortex tornado set down, literally devastating Joplin, Missouri. It killed 181 people. It injured 1,000 more and flattened 7,500 homes and led to $3 billion of damage in terms of cleanup. I'd say that the connection between them was never closer. People in that city those days had every reason to remember these Janis Joplin lyrics. You remember them too. Down on me, looks like the whole world is down on me, and that's certainly what they were feeling. But they didn't allow themselves to really fall apart. What they did was remarkable. It was inspiring. They didn't just pick up. They didn't just rebuild. They actually reimagined. So Joplin held a town meeting, and hundreds of citizens left more than 1,000 sticky notes with individual ideas about how they could rebuild the city faster, better, more sustainable, whether it was burying the electric lines or building different kinds of roads, making themselves greener, adding bike paths. So many ideas to really improve the city. And then they went to work. But this was a community that had very strong social cohesion and strong middle-level civic institutions before the tornado. And they had to call on that resilience. And we are going to add many definitions of resilience, or many pieces of texture to the definitions of resilience that we'll be developing throughout this meeting. And I want to add ours and begin to put, or add to Andrew's texture with some of my own. Because, of course, it's not just Joplin. Everywhere we look, we see vulnerabilities. And what's so important about this moment is that those vulnerabilities are increasingly interconnected. We saw them when a global credit crisis rippled out from Reykjavik. We saw them when a global financial crisis rippled out from the United States, when the housing bubble burst. We saw them when floods in Bangkok wrought havoc on global supply chains, and when a pandemic passed from a handshake in Asia to a 747, and then literally across the globe in the blink of an eye. But let's take a minute to consider risks that are less discussed, perhaps, but no less disruptive. Look at your cell phones for a moment, and I hope you've shut them off by now. Many of their most sensitive components are derived from rare earth metals that are mined in Central Africa. It's actually the tungsten in your phones that make them vibrate. And those are the metals that are used in everything from jet turbines to high-tech medical devices. Armed groups, as we know, are already fighting to control and own these conflict minerals. Imagine then further conflict or an extreme weather event that could cause a global shortage in tungsten and even more skyrocketing prices. That could keep the global poor from using mobile technology, just as we are beginning to find all of the mechanisms that allow them to have access to mobile finance or mobile health. So many things that are really going to be central in lifting people's lives from poverty and vulnerability. Or imagine a constant stream of data leaks that significantly compromise cybersecurity or even national security. Past data leaks have already caused international consternation, diplomatic resignations, including the US ambassador to Mexico, and the director of Al Jazeera. Imagine if secure data, such as the identity of covert operatives or even nuclear codes, were released into the public domain. My point is that whether they're shocks and stresses from weather events that we see as more and more predictable, or those that are more and more unforeseen but lurking out there, we are going to be seeing more of this. And so, all of us together in building resilience will need to be producing more of this. That is, the good ideas, the good thinking that can make us more resilient. That's why we at Rockefeller have been trying, using our tools. Our tools are really intervening, influencing, and innovating, we hope, to pursue a range of initiatives that identify and pilot new projects, ones that allow us to integrate multiple stakeholders, such as those in this room, and begin to really demonstrate what it's like to build intentionally long-term capacity all around the concept of resilience. So I will, as Andrew did, begin by defining resilience, at least as we think about it. But let me remind us, since Andrew had so many historical literations, that as far back as the 17th century, Sir Francis Bacon used the term resilience. We also see resilience in the language of the philosopher Henry Moore. Resilience is used to describe the hardwood court of Madison Square Garden and the scrappy team that plays on it. Resilience was even the title of a well-reviewed but poorly received film a few years ago. So we know it's a word that's been stretched and flexed and bent, but its meaning actually is quite precise. Some different words, some synthesis, but I think you'll see the same in mine as in Andrew's. The capacity of individuals, communities, and systems to survive, to adapt, and grow in the face of changes, even in the face of catastrophic incidents. Andrew talked about a number of characteristics. I'd like to summarize them into maybe 4 that I think are part of the central core of the several that he noted. The first is robustness, and by robustness I mean the inherent strength to withstand external demands without loss of functionality. And it's the without loss of functionality that's really critical here. The second, redundancy, more obvious, but properties within the system or within the individual that allow alternative options or substitutions to occur even under stress. Again, emphasize even under stress, which is where the redundancy is often called upon. Third, resourcefulness, and a lot of Andrews really roll up, I think, into this. The capacity to mobilize needed resources in emergencies. And then fourth, rapidity, the speed. The speed is important here of a response with which disruption can be overcome and safety, services, and financial stability restored. So again, we'll continue to build on these definitions, but you are starting to see in Andrews by looking at a systems level as well as at an individual level. In this one, by trying to aggregate across the system, but recognizing that we are talking about the whole system and then the institutions and the individuals within that system. All of these elements of redundancy and robustness and resourcefulness and rapidity are called into question when the system is stressed, and we're looking at the capacity to respond adaptively, and often we think to transform, sometimes for the better, in the face of those responses. So that's what this conference is about. Let me build on Andrew's point by emphasizing why I think we're talking about it at this moment. I think you're here, and we're all talking about resilience quite a lot, because we are seeing in these early decades of the 21st century an extraordinary proliferation of new shocks and stressors. Volatility, Andrew once told me, is the new norm. I agree with that. Just ask Iceland's very volatile volcanoes. We see volatility wherever we look. The long-held fundamentals of our modern economic system, which have been globalization and free trade, have certainly increased the efficiency of markets, but they actually may well be reducing the resilience of economies and indeed the resilience of societies. And that is a fundamental principle that we are going to have to confront in the 21st century. Industrialization in the last century gave us a rapidly growing global population, but a warming world in this one. That warming world is changing how and where this growing population will live, and I think in many cases whether they'll survive. What distinguishes today's threats from the past is the escalating rate at which they're occurring, and also the interconnectedness of our planet. And these are the two converging forces that make this moment so different. Individual issues that were once analyzed, identified individually, whether it's the environment or our economy or social challenges, are now inextricably linked. Shocks, stresses in a single place inevitably have the capacity and do ricochet from one place to another. Vulnerability in one area leads to vulnerability in many areas. Today, no country is an island, even a country that is an island. We may not know exactly how our resilience will be tested, but we know very, very well, because we've seen it already, that those tests will come, and that they will come at the seams where our economies and our communities and our technologies intersect. So all the things that we've been building are now bumping up, and these seams are stressors themselves and getting more stress from these converging forces. We're confronted with whole new ways, therefore, that we have to think about systems and actors. And we find it congenial, and many of you as well, to do so through the lens of resilience. Our approach at Rockefeller is to think about this broadly and globally, and to really think, because resilience requires this, we believe, that nothing is out of bounds in terms of our approaching this question when it comes to building resilience. We're not a bank, but we've been involved lately in transforming the way capital markets operate. We're not a think tank, but we've been involved in piloting interventions and then taking them to scale. We're not elected, but local and state and national governments are sometimes our funding partners, sometimes they're our targets of influence, and sometimes they're our grantees. It gives us the freedom to facilitate, to connect, to test, to promote a broad range of options across the globe, and to have these ideas and these connections really flow freely, because the challenge of the day is the fact that these interconnections are increasing our risk. We need to build interconnected capacities to reduce that risk through the idea of resilience. It gives us this freedom in a way that we feel is very powerful. Our approach is to seek out and support pioneers whose creative insights help us prepare for and rebound from the crises we see and those we don't see coming, because that's core to resilience. As we see it, there are multiple dimensions of resilience, and I think this frames the rest of our conversation, because we'll be sampling from experts and thinkers in a variety of these. You can read them, but it is important to know that while they are separated by lines, the important thing about it is that they clearly leverage from and to one another. There are deep interconnections, but more or less of them are called upon, depending on what the circumstance is. I want to give a few examples, again, recognizing that all are critical. I'll focus first on social resilience. Social resilience actually focuses on the human dimension and on human development, and actually, in doing so, puts the role of the individual or the role of civic institutions as a key element in building and sustaining resilience. And sometimes that's left out of the discussion, although not here in these 2 days. But when you think about social resilience, you're really looking at individual change, intrapsychic and interpersonal change, but also transformative change by creating strong bonds across similar groups, by creating bridges across diverse groups, and links between different levels of institutions, which is a very core element of building resilience in this way of thinking. Let me illustrate with the story of a Kenyan slum where we work, and just to confuse you, it's called Kosovo. For years, the residents of Kosovo had been maltreated by local government and all the local companies. When the Nairobi Water and Sewage Company found illegal hookups, which they did many times a week, they just cut off the water, and then they cut off electricity service. And the government, people were putting in other informal hookups, and the government proposed raising all the informal water hookups on the Nairobi River. It took that for the slum dwellers to begin to organize. They realized first, and this is so key in the thinking about resilience, that they were actually uncounted. They were not shown on any maps, and they were uncounted in any census. And so the government could literally act as if they didn't count. So they began gathering valuable systematic information about themselves, literally forcing the government to count them. Supported by our great grantee, Pamoja Trust, they built their collective power, and then they used it to obtain formal connections from that water company for the very first time. And then they organized street committees, think about social resilience, to ensure that everyone pays their fair share. So they became part of the structure and the fabric of the institutions that were necessary to consolidate the gains that they were seeking. They forced the municipal government to take notice. So much so that when the World Bank was planning to invest $100 million in upgrading the slums in Nairobi, these slum dweller leaders were represented at the table. And they have now become part of a growing global movement through Slum Dwellers International, which is to translate a fantastic, truly fantastic organization, led by Sheila Patel from the Mumbai slums. They're translating models of community empowerment, models of building social resilience into really sustainable, tangible gains. They're proving that even the most disenfranchised people in the world can bounce back from adversity, that they can join together creatively to upend entrenched systems, they can hold leadership accountable, and they can bring stakeholders together, which facilitates the spread of new ideas and new ways of thinking, but continues to bolster their own resilience and their own capacity to survive and thrive. We've supported similar social resilience building in Vietnam after a study determined that female heads of households and from the poorest of the poor households are the most vulnerable to what is now almost annual typhoon damage, year after year having to move the families out of the homes because the roofs blow off and the huts actually flood. There was already a women's credit union that all of them were members of that had developed to give microloans for business. And the women themselves recognized that if they got together and they repurposed the money that they had saved, and they used it to put new roofs on and new kinds of storm drains in their houses, that they wouldn't have to move out year after year, and that this was a more important community effort that the women could really accomplish for themselves initially than the microloan. And they built some extraordinary defenses, physical defenses, linked to their social defenses. But it relied on the social resilience and the social institution of the credit union that they had already developed and come to rely on. Resilience has to be built in these other four domains as well: the physical, the institutional, and ecological, and economic. They are all critically important. And with that in mind, I'd like, again, to just put some meat on the bones by giving you a few other examples from work we already have in progress. I'm doing this not so much to talk about Rockefeller as to really give tangible examples from work that is actually on the ground so that you can see how some of these efforts are unfolding and the impact and potential capacity that they have. The first is a network called ACERN, the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network. Why are we working in Asia? Because during the next 3 decades, 60% of the world's population increase will occur in Asian cities. And 8 of the 10 countries that are most vulnerable to climate change's effects are on that continent. It's a continent that will have unbelievable rapid urbanization, sometimes with very little planning. And there's a great deal of climate uncertainty in the region. They can no longer mitigate and combat climate change in that way. So they have got to adapt, in other words, to become more resilient to the effects of the climate change that's already occurred. In 10 cities across 4 countries, Vietnam, Thailand, India, and Indonesia, we are mobilizing local governments, NGOs, scientists, planners, disaster management specialists. All of them are collaborating with inhabitants on building resilience projects to withstand the climate change effects that can no longer be prevented, that are already here today. One example, ACERN is helping to restore the mangrove forests along the periphery of the Vietnamese coastal city of Quy Nhon. Vietnam is very much at risk because they have so many coastal cities which are experiencing explosive growth of population and also explosive development. We were in Da Nang a few months ago and saw huge casino and hotel projects that had been planned all along the most vulnerable coastline in Da Nang, and through the intervention of the ACERN workers and hydrology mapping, that set of projects is now stopped. Here in Quy Nhon, the problem was that when they cut down the mangroves to make room for hotels and also for aquaculture exports, they made the city's poorest even more vulnerable to floods and climate effects. Now the reinstatement of the mangrove groves and the mangrove trees will protect the city's poor from rising sea levels, while simultaneously sequestering carbon to reduce the temperature in hot weather and obviously promote greater climate change mitigation. Work here is also building more resilient sewage systems and also linking federal dam management workers upstream with the municipal disaster management and NGOs downstream so that there can be more coordination. Before, in order to prevent upstream flooding, the dams were released, and there was never any knowledge downstream about when those waters were coming, and the poor were wiped out over and over and over again. So sometimes resilience building requires a system of interconnections that are more than just geographic. All of this will help that they have the hard infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, and the civic infrastructure to meet the challenges of rising sea levels. ACERN is now sharing what they've learned, first with 40 Asian cities, and we've secured significant funding to bring this now to 40 other cities, and then the learning will be catalyzed around the world. To take a second example, a continent away, African nations, of course, are grappling with their own challenges, both of climate and population. Crop yields in sub-Saharan Africa are projected to fall at least 20% by 2050. And they mostly are relying still only on rain-fed irrigation in most countries in sub-Saharan Africa. This is a time, however, when the region's population growth will surpass even India's explosive growth. Yet you really rarely hear about these systemic threats on CNN or even from your own favorite charities. Over 80% of humanitarian aid focuses on emergency response rather than on disaster reduction. I think distended bellies make for good ratings and response rates. whereas the slow, silent factors that lead to drought and famine do not. To reverse this trend, Rockefeller has funded Oxfam and the UN World Food Programme's Rural Resilience Initiative, which emphasizes something that we believe fundamentally, that it costs less to manage risk than to provide disaster relief. Their solution, insurance, in a region where these are pervasive, but this is unheard of. Through a microinsurance system that compensates farmers in the event of insufficient rainfall, Ethiopian farmers, smallholder farmers like Medan Reta, can pay their premiums by working on community projects like building irrigation systems or revegetating the shared hillsides. For her, this means that even though in the last planting season the rains came 6 weeks late, they came and came and came. She then got an insurance payout that allowed her to feed her family, send her youngest daughter to school, and be able to buy enough seed to replant for the next season. And the community labor that she and others are doing is making their region in Ethiopia more resilient to the harsh impacts of climate change. So her work is also helping build resilience because she can't afford the cost of the insurance. In just 3 years, this initiative has grown to encompass 1,300 farmers. It's now being extended all throughout Ethiopia and moved to Senegal, and again, we hope across sub-Saharan Africa. It is only one of a number of rainfall-indexed efforts to cushion those communities from climate events. It is a key core resilience-building component for these people in sub-Saharan Africa. Let me talk about a third and last, and that is transportation. In the US, the Rockefeller Foundation's Road to Resilience initiative has focused literally on the way to rebuild resilience into America's aging infrastructure. A Center for National Policy report observed that transportation resilience can provide security and safety as well as bolster our economic competitiveness. At the same time, it noted, and I quote, "Modern Americans are acting like grandchildren who are heirs to a mansion that they refuse to maintain," meaning everything looks fine from the outside, but it's falling apart from within. This is not just not resilient, but run down. China has invested in the last 10 years $3.3 trillion in cutting-edge infrastructure. We have 1 in 9 bridges falling down. Given such glaring vulnerabilities, a natural or man-made disaster would cripple America's ability to respond and bounce back, and we've started to see the leading edges of some of that. But instead of meeting these challenges of ensuring that our infrastructure and transportation policy is sustainable and equitable and resilient, America's Congress is as gridlocked as its roads. So the Rockefeller Foundation is working to provide the direction and the drive to build a more resilient 21st century transportation system, in this case working around our federal government. With Washington paralyzed, we've partnered with policymakers and private sector funders at the local and state level to repair and build and rebuild smarter. In California, for instance, we're helping to develop sustainable community strategies. Indeed, we worked with California, and now there's a new state law mandating such strategies. Los Angeles, a big car-driven city, has just completed its own ambitious plan. By 2035, 87% of all housing in LA will be within a half a mile of public transit. Families will save $3,000 a year on transportation costs and will have reduced carbon emissions in the greater LA area by 16%. This is really crucial, and now you can imagine as this spreads through California, and we hope throughout the United States. However slowly, the wheels of reform are turning, but it is a very heavy lift, and we feel it in the US intensively, both literally and metaphorically. I think we have to, create a more resilient society, one that absorbs shocks and stresses, one that responds more quickly and more effectively and rebounds more adaptively, more subtle, more supple, more strong. This is within our power. But sustaining such a system will require effectively harnessing virtually all of the systems I've mentioned today. So here's my conclusion for those of us assembled here. Building resilience is not, in fact, it cannot be the task of a single actor or a single sector, no matter how innovative or how passionate that actor or that sector is, no matter how well funded. Building resilience requires global partners from every sector, because resilience requires governments with the right policies and plans and infrastructure investments. It requires communities building civic institutions and connections that are flexible and responsive and robust. It requires developing individuals with stronger coping skills and organizations that are more adaptive, because we cannot know which shocks will come. We cannot know how they will ripple out and touch our lives and whose lives they will touch. But we absolutely do know that increasingly in this century, they will be felt. Ernest Hemingway elegantly wrote, "The world breaks everyone, and afterward, many are strong at the broken places." I think that's true whether we mean the resilience of the human spirit or the resilience of our political and economic institutions. Or a small city in Missouri. Right after the tornado struck Joplin, the residents saw this. No, they saw a bad thing first, and then after a year later, when the students were ready to graduate, this is what they saw as they stood in their makeshift mall and received their diplomas a year later under a bright blue sky. Likewise, we're awed by the amazing resilience of the people of Iceland as they rebuild a stronger and much more resilient economic system. We're struck by the people of Japan, the resilient people of Japan, as they rebuild from last year's earthquake and nuclear power crisis. And the people of Pakistan as they recover from the catastrophic flooding in 2010. So how will we ensure that a major shock that hits our people, our institutions, our community, our infrastructure, our broken places, can heal faster and heal stronger? I think this is one of the questions that is of the greatest challenge facing us in the 21st century. We at the Rockefeller Foundation believe that focusing on building resilience and building more opportunity through equitable growth is at the heart of the answer. And I'm very eager to continue this conversation with you as we have this exciting meeting over the next 2 days and to learn from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.